17 years ago, my father shut the door on me and decided I was no longer his daughter, and I can still feel the cold rain soaking through my clothes as I stood there with one duffel bag, realizing that the life I knew had ended in a single moment. That was the night I stopped being a Laura Bennett, the obedient child, and became someone he chose to erase. His voice stayed with me long after I walked away, telling me if I wanted that kind of life, then I could live it without him. And I did exactly that. I built everything on my own, far from his control. But nothing in all those years prepared me for the day I found myself holding an invitation to my younger brother Daniel's wedding. The harbor outside my apartment was wrapped in fog that morning, the sound of distant horns blending with the smell of coffee as I turned the envelope over in my hands. My last name written like nothing had ever broken between us. Inside was a formal invitation, carefully printed, and there it was, the word that stopped me cold. Family. After everything that had happened, after 17 years of silence, somehow I was still included. Before I could make sense of it, my phone buzzed. A message with no name attached, telling me not to come and not to make things worse. I didn't need to guess who had sent it. I set the phone down and let out a quiet breath before saying out loud that I was going anyway. Not for him, but for Daniel. On the counter beside me sat a strip of old gauze stiff with salt, something I had kept hidden for years, a reminder of the life I had built. Back then I had walked out into a storm with nothing but a bag and an acceptance letter into a flight rescue program my father refused to acknowledge. He had pushed other options toward me, safer ones he understood, but I chose the sky, and he responded by opening the door and telling me to leave. My mother cried, my brother said nothing, and I stepped into the rain knowing I was on my own. Over the years, I built a life in the air, flying into situations most people avoided. One entry in my old flight log stood out as I sat at my table that morning. A coastal rescue during a storm. A teenage girl stranded on a cliff, shaking and barely holding on. I remembered lowering myself down through the wind, the ocean crashing below, pressing my forehead to hers, and telling her to breathe, to focus, to hold on. We made it out alive. Later, I received a short message signed only with an initial. I never knew who she was until weeks before the wedding, when Daniel's fiancé looked at me and told me the truth. She had been that girl. She had spent years trying to find me, and now she wanted everyone to know. At the rehearsal dinner, I kept things simple, sitting quietly as my father took his place at the head of the table like nothing had changed. When he finally spoke, it was exactly what I expected. A dismissive comment about my work, said loudly enough for everyone to hear. The room went still until someone spoke up. Then another. People began sharing stories of how my work had helped them or someone they loved. For a moment, there was something like respect in the room, but he shut it down quickly, brushing it all aside. I didn't argue. I didn't need to. Hannah's hand found mine under the table, and she whispered that tomorrow she would tell them everything. That night, I sat alone listening to the wind against the windows, opening a box I had not touched in years. Inside was a letter from my mother, filled with quiet hope, and another letter I had once written to my father that I never sent. I also found the message from earlier, and confirmed it had come from him. Nothing had changed. I saved it, then deleted it, not because I was giving in, but because I didn't need to carry it forward. I closed the box, placed the gauze on top, and sat there listening to the storm, knowing the next day would bring everything into the open. The wedding took place in a boathouse by the water, decorated with lights and flowers, but still carrying the scent of salt and wood. The atmosphere was warm at first, filled with quiet laughter and conversation, until my father stood to speak, and once again reduced my work to something meaningless. But this time the reaction was different. People pushed back, voices rising one by one as they shared what my work had meant to them. I stayed quiet and watched the shift happen. Then Hannah stepped forward, holding a microphone, her voice unsteady at first, but growing stronger as she told the story of the night she nearly died on a cliff and the woman who came down through the storm to save her. She looked directly at me when she said it, telling everyone that woman was standing there with them. The room fell silent before the applause began and grew into something overwhelming. Daniel joined her and explained how they had found me and how they had built something meaningful inspired by that rescue. And for the first time in years, I felt seen for who I was, rather than who I had been. In the middle of it all, I noticed my father sitting completely still, unable to interrupt what he could no longer control. Then the night shifted again when the power suddenly went out. Darkness filled the room, and panic followed until a man collapsed near the front. Instinct took over as I moved through the crowd, checked his pulse, and began compressions when I found none. Voices blurred around me as I gave instructions, asking for light and space. At one point, my father stood too close, frozen, and I told him to move. And for the first time in my life, he did without hesitation. I kept working until emergency responders arrived, and just before they took over, the man gasped and came back. Relief spread through the room, quieter this time, but deeper. After everything settled, I stepped outside into the damp night air, trying to steady myself, when my father approached. He looked older and smaller than I remembered. I showed him the message he had sent earlier, not to accuse, but to make the truth unavoidable. He didn't argue or deny it. He admitted in a strained voice that he didn't know how to face what he had done, or who I had become. Daniel joined us and reminded us that the past could not be changed, but the future was still open. Hannah handed me the microphone again and asked me to say something. I turned back to the room and kept it simple, telling them that when someone shuts a door on you, it does not mean you stop moving forward. It means you find another way to build your life. The response was soft, but sincere. When I looked back at my father, his expression had changed. Not pride or approval, but something closer to acceptance. The next morning I was back in the air, where everything made sense. Lifting the helicopter, as the coastline stretched out beneath me, and the fog slowly cleared. My phone lit up with a message from him, the first real one in years, asking if we could talk without bringing the past into it. I read it once and set it aside without answering, not because I had decided no, but because I did not need to decide yet. The horizon was wide open in front of me, and for the first time I understood that whatever came next would be on my terms.